Two little mice fell into a bucket of cream. The first mouse quickly gave up and drowned, but the second mouse, he struggled so hard that he eventually churned that cream into butter. And he walked out. Amen.
Welcome to Successful Dropout. This podcast is for the outliers, the innovators, the rebels, those that dare to dream and act on their dreams. I'm your host, Kylan Ginger. Join me as we find out what it takes to drop out, grind, and succeed. Hey, just wanted to take a quick moment to tell you about Audible.com, an app I use on almost a daily basis because it's an incredibly affordable and convenient way to learn and read on the go. You'll love it for, I'm sure, all the same reasons you love listening to podcasts. If you are new to Audible, go to successfuldropout.com/book to claim your first audiobook free when you sign up. After that, it's only $15 a month and you can cancel at any time. That $15 gets you one book credit and you can use that to download any audiobook you want for that month, regardless of price. So it's very cost effective. If you decide you don't like the book, you can simply exchange it for another book free of charge. So again, if you are new to audible.com, go to successfuldropout.com/book to get your free audiobook through this podcast. You can also see my personal library and reading stats there because I posted some screenshots. Again, that is successfuldropout.com/book. What is up, Successful Dropouts? Get stoked because today on the show we have Brett Veinotte. I pronounced that correctly, right?
That was perfect. You nailed it.
Okay. We have Brett Veinotte. Brett has been involved in education for 12 years in a variety of different capacities. Actually, is it more than 12 years, Brett? I think I might have gotten this off of a older bio.
Wow. You know, I just thought about that. That is an old bio that it is my responsibility to update, Kylan. That's from like when I started the show. So now, if we're going to stick with a variety of capacities, my educational career, including what I do now, spans 17 years, going back to pretty much when I was just a lad. Yeah, like right out of college, still in college, actually.
Oh, man. Okay, so yeah, and I want to get into all that. But for people listening, I discovered Brett through the School Sucks podcast and the YouTube channel and kind of the online community where he teaches thousands of people the art of self-education, critical thinking, self-knowledge, personal growth, and a whole lot more that I want to dive into. And I'm sure this isn't the first time that we'll have Brett on the show. What we do is definitely in the same vein, and just talking with him for a few minutes here before we launch the episode, I can tell we have a lot in common, and the conversation is going to be really good. So Brett, I know you've done a lot. It seems like you have a story with a lot of different facets. So maybe kind of give us an overview of what you do now, and I guess how you got here.
Yeah, absolutely. My current work is called the School Sucks Project, which started as just a podcast about 8 years ago. And at the time, I was running a small tutoring company in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and I had a lot of frustrations. I was seeing the public school system from a variety of different angles. I felt like for, a lot of these kids, especially kids with a lot of potential, the school itself and, their future schooling in the form of college that I was helping them prepare for as a college consultant or an SAT tutor. In many cases, it was a real opportunity cost. And, I started to feel through various phases of my career, going back all the way to the beginning, after a certain amount of time in one specific job, I would get the sense that I was a participant in the problem. Something that made me useful in that system. And if I wasn't participating in what I saw as the problem of schooling, then I wasn't going to be very useful anymore. So the way I describe it on my show is I went through all these different jobs working with young people, and I would kind of learn my way out of one after another. Now, of course, when you get to a place that you like in life and you look back and you think about your story, it's kind of told as if you always had this, vision and you're trying to get to this next better place. But while it's happening, it feels like, you're running through a maze blindfolded while people are throwing firecrackers at you or something.
Yes.
So it was definitely hectic, and a lot of failure and frustration along the way, a lot of second guessing myself. But I made the right career moves to learn a lot about the difference between institutionalized schooling and actual authentic self-directed education. And by the time I got to be about 30 years old, I knew which one I wanted to be involved in, and it was the latter. And I started School Sucks Project as a kind of journaling exercise, almost as a kind of therapy, an outlet for all of the things that I couldn't say, because if I said them regularly enough, they would start costing me clients and probably ultimately my job or my business. So the School Sucks Project, I was perfectly comfortable through the first few episodes with just like 50 to 100 downloads. And, I was getting it out there, and, I thought it might be 10 or 20 episodes, almost like an audiobook format. Right. But in that time, we got some decent exposure. We connected with the right people in like the libertarian or unschooling community. And, within a few months, the show was pretty popular. I was getting asked to speak places. People started donating, which was, the first time somebody asked,
wow.
Can I send you money? After doing it for a couple months, and this guy, Patrick from the UK, sent me $100. It was like, oh my God, maybe this has potential. I never thought of it being that, I just thought of it really, really being a way to vent, like turning that valve to let, hot air out. And the first 20, but our goal is basically helping people achieve individual liberty through self-knowledge. So we talk a lot about like self-improvement psychology, self-teaching. So we talk a lot about critical thinking, bullshit detection, logical fallacies, and self-mastery, which is, across a number of categories, everything from philosophy, psychology, health and fitness. If it's educational and it's not taught in school, we'll take it on at School Sucks.
That's awesome, man. And so is that what you do full time now, pretty much?
Yeah, it is. I quit. I say I quit my job. I stopped answering the phone. It was a word of mouth business in about, I think it was like the winter into the spring of 2014. And I had modified my living conditions. So they were very simple and very affordable. And I said, okay, 2014 is the year to make this happen. So I just started cranking out lots of what I thought my audience, based on what I knew about my audience at that time, would consider high value content. And all we did at the time was we had a subscription model where if people liked the show, they could send us, $6 a month, and they could get access to like a couple hundred hours of additional content. So I started that in 2013, and it really took off in 2014. And the upward trajectory was so nice that I just stopped, seeking new tutoring business. I thought I could, that was a lot of unpaid time, so I could just redirect that into, the production. And I had set myself up with a living situation that made that possible. So, I haven't taken on a tutoring client in over 3 years. That's what I was doing to make a living before.
Well, I love it, man. It sure seems like you're in a space that you're really passionate about now, doing work you love. And tell me, though, a little bit about the newest series on your podcast. I just started listening to the introduction episode today, but tell us a little bit about that, because it seems like your podcast, it kind of comes in segments and series. Is that correct? Yeah, absolutely. And if I I tend to like focus in on some topic, and then I start to realize how big that topic actually is, and like one show just doesn't do it justice. So it becomes a series. And, some series are intentional and some series are more accidental. So for the last couple of years, in the midst of this higher education, social justice war and all these identity politics and all these ridiculous things we've been seeing on college campuses, I fell for it. I got sucked into that. I got trolled, and I was talking about it on the show and sort of doing the thing that I don't want to do on the show, which is hysterically react to things that someday nobody will care about. There's just so much of that in alternative media and on YouTube. I really wanted to be a kind of steady ship in choppy waters, where what School Sucks is, we're always going forward,
just calmly and giving people the tools they need to be more free in a very unfree world. So I said, okay, well, all this emotion and energy has now been dumped into this higher education crisis. I have to explore it for myself. I have to understand why I actually care about it. Like, why am I letting this get my goat over and over and over again? And also, how can we make this constructive? How can we where's the learning opportunity here? So the first question was, where do these ideas come from and why are they popular today? So that meant a sort of basic search through certain types of philosophy. And I brought in a lot of academics to do that. But as that starts to happen, it's like you keep coming to these points where you think you're at the horizon and you think you've seen all there is to see, and then there's another one, and then another one, and then another one. Right. It just continues to unfold. And it's funny, like I'm starting to actually agree with some of these postmodernist thinkers that I set out to criticize about how actually getting at the truth is a bit of a trick sometimes, because most things are infinitely complex. You can just continue to dig and dig and dig and unpack and unpack. And, I find myself in the middle of that right now. So now I'm actually reaching out to other academics. I'm talking to a friend of mine in Australia who's a total expert on this very influential postmodernist thinker, Michel Foucault. And he and I are getting ready to do like a 2 or 3-parter about him. So it's like I'm letting curiosity, but also gaps in my knowledge take me new places, which is kind of the thing that I try to model, because I'm not an academic. I'm not an intellectual. I'm not particularly smarter than most of the people in the audience. I'm just kind of the guide, and people can watch me learn, watch me succeed, watch me fail. There's been plenty of that. But I wanted to, once I started to interact with people in my audience and I realized how smart they were, I realized that this was going to have to take on a different format than the show had, like in the beginning, back in 2009 and 2010, where I had this teacher mentality, where I was sure that I was talking to a bunch of people who weren't as smart as me, or weren't as knowledgeable as me. That's not the case today. So this is more of a community. It's more of a cooperative effort. And I try to, with whatever free time I have available, take feedback, incorporate ideas from the audience. I have 2 Facebook groups. One is just for premium members who support the show, and then there's a massive group that has, like, I've been trying to cap it at like 2,000 people because it gets a little cacophonous if it goes, I should be probably
on the Facebook group, you mean?
Yeah. So there's about 2,000 people in there now, and I try to screen people based on like mutual friends. How many groups are you in? How long have you been on Facebook? Like, if someone's in like 600 Facebook groups, they're just kind of into joining groups, and I want people who are like invested and interested in the show and our mission. So I screen it kind of carefully, which is how I keep it at a certain number. But the discussions that have taken place in that group over the last year are just so interesting and invigorating, and have sent me in new directions. And I've wanted to create content based on not just suggestions, but even like debates that take place in the group. So it's a very cool synergistic community that's developed basically by the revelation that I don't know everything. So it's very, yeah.
And I think that's what I like about you so much right off the bat, Brett, is the fact that you really foster that curiosity, and you search for truth. There's a continual search for truth there. It's something that I definitely enjoy. I would definitely not consider myself an intellectual, but I love the mental acrobats of constantly questioning my beliefs and looking for people that believe differently than I do to get their side of the story. And even just listening to the first half of this intro episode for your new series, I can't remember his name, but he was talking about the origins of postmodernism and kind of where it all came from, and it was just opening up a different way of thinking for me already. And then I heard some Jordan Peterson on there. Have you been able to get him in person on the show yet, or I think they were just some of his recordings, weren't they? That's a really interesting question. I actually bought Peterson's self-authoring suite recently because I was interested in creating a clear picture of my future. One of the things that I've struggled with is like setting those, 3-year goals, 5-year goals, and sticking to them.
So I wanted to like learn more through this actual exercise developed by a psychologist that has been so helpful for so many wayward college students. Maybe I can do this. And then like I got into the past authoring because he said if you have memories that are more than 18 months old, do past authoring. So I'm going through all these journaling exercises because I want to talk to him about that. I don't want to talk to him about the same thing that he's been forced to talk about over and over and over again. And I don't want to see somebody who's so valuable and so interesting kind of pigeonholed as like the guy who says no to new pronouns, right? There's like so much more to him than that. And it's really kind of tragic, that all of these people just see him as this bad guy or this ignorant guy, ironically, when he has so much value. Disagree with him or not about, his theology or his philosophy, but he is just such a valuable resource. And I want to talk to him about that, not about the controversies that he's generated. So I'm working on it. Yeah. Short answer, I'm working on it.
No, yeah, I admire that. That's awesome. And maybe switching subjects just a tad here. I'm curious, since we're on successful dropout and we mainly talk about higher education here, I'm curious just what do you think of the state of higher education as it is right now?
Well, I think we could approach that question from a number of different angles. I think there's, the financial question where at this point we're watching this race between, what's going to implode first, this student loan bubble or this idea that college is valuable bubble, right? I think the sooner the latter implodes, the better, because there are so many people marching into colleges and universities like it's the 13th grade. It's absolutely mandatory to have any success in life. And I see a lot of people who are leaving college in a worse position to succeed, especially with a lot of these humanities and social sciences majors that are becoming increasingly popular today. They're in a worse position to achieve success than they were when they went into college 4, 5, 6 years earlier. So there's that angle. I mean, the social aspect of college, I worry. I think it's a great place to become a stronger, adult if you're a white male, because everybody is lining up against you. And you're very bad and you're getting it from all sides. So you're actually getting this kind of personal fortification, which is kind of like the opposite intention that I think a lot of those people are trying to have. Right. But I think there's a coddling. There's a lot of, placation and patronization that really isn't helping people with their thinking or their emotional states. And it's kind of terrifying that a lot of these people are going to be decision makers in shaping the world of the future. And one of the reasons why it scares me is this problem that we see where people are freaking out on video or crying at a speaker they don't like or pulling the fire alarm. This is a tiny minority of people, right? I mean, this is not par for the course in higher education, and you can go to just about, I would think, any school. I mean, so maybe there's a few exceptions like, Evergreen College or Berkeley, where you go there and you can just see how insane it actually is. But at most universities, including the Ivy League that's right by me here, Dartmouth University, you're going to walk around the campus and it's just going to look like, a normal college setting. There aren't, it's not the movie PCU. There aren't people marching around with protest signs. It's just people going about their business and trying to succeed. So this is a tiny minority of people, but what makes me apprehensive about the future of these like humanities and social sciences programs is I know that it was a small group of academics who did not require mainstream approval for the things they wanted to do in the early 20th century to provide the intellectual ammunition for shaping the schools, how they were shaped, throughout the 20th century, for shaping the progressive era, for shaping a lot of American politics that drifted pretty hard to the left by the 1930s with FDR. Those were academic projects, and those people were working in fringe sectors of academia, just like the social sciences people and the humanities people are today. Now, they had an impact in the past. That doesn't mean that history will automatically repeat itself, but it's certainly scary if it does, considering where a lot of these people's minds are at today, and a lot of the solutions they're proposing to the social injustices they perceive in the world. So I think for many people, it has become a toxic environment as those fringe areas of study, and they're not like super fringe. I think the behavior that we see is fairly fringe and fairly limited. But these, as this spreads out and affects the whole college culture, people demanding that presidents resign, it's very, very disruptive in a bad way. I think that's going to be an increasingly toxic and increasingly uneducational environment for more and more students. So there's two huge problems right there that I haven't heard, really good arguments against. Like, well, no, don't worry about that, Brett. Like, I'm worried about those things. Right.
And I'm curious, what do you see as maybe some possible solutions to that being?
Well, the thing that we were talking about this before we started. I mean, the thing that I'm most in love with right now is a program like Praxis. I've talked to Isaac Morehouse and Zach Slayback on the show in the past, and I'm so excited about what they're doing. They're able to offer people a direct path to employment, right? Because we might lose people when we say, don't go to college, be an entrepreneur, right? That doesn't really mean much to most people, because what have they ever heard about entrepreneurship or starting your own business if they're coming out of public school? It's almost like a foreign language. So if we want to, as Zach Slayback says, build a better credential than the college degree, you need to give people something tangible first. You have to have a proof of concept, and Praxis is providing that. They're taking people who have this potential, they're putting them in this program, they're giving them a direct route to a successful career, far more affordable than the college path. And right. They've got tons of success stories piling up. So if it's about going from school to work, or even like home education to work, Praxis is the thing that I'm most excited about in that realm right now.
Do you notice any other up-and-coming organizations that are providing similar solutions, or any other organizations that you're kind of excited about?
I'm also excited about Exosphere. Exosphere is a little different than Praxis, and that's taking place in South America. It's run by a man named Skinner Lane, and it's another higher education alternative, but I think it happens more in a creative, technical space. And I definitely encourage people in your audience to do their own research. I've also had those guys on my show in the past. But beyond that, I haven't really looked too hard there. I mean, it's definitely, your question makes me realize it's probably something I should do a little more research on, because there is, hopefully, I'm really, really hoping there's going to be much more of a demand for that in the next 5 years, how people can succeed without college.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, well, actually that kind of brings up another question in my mind. I wonder what you think the future of higher education is then, maybe say in the next 5-10 years. Do you think, I kind of think on some level it might just mean that there's more options besides formal education. I mean, would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, I think there definitely will be a lot more options as more of these concepts are proved. But I think that it's very hard for me to see a lot of these schools continuing to exist more than 20 years into the future. Like, I mean, the writing is on the wall now. And I also think that, I'm not an economist, but I'm wondering how long this student loan current situation can even be sustained. Like, how much longer can the government continue to even offer these loans to people, especially when at some point you have to look at what's happening on the other end. Less than 50% of outstanding student loans have had a payment made on them in the last 7 years. You know, the outstanding debt is over $1 trillion. I mean, and the default rate, I think, is approaching 25%. So
wow.
There has to be a point, and I don't know what's happening in, you know, meeting rooms that I'm not privy to, but there must be some discussion about this problem as, you know, more money is just funneled in, and you see like the administration grow, you see new buildings go up, you see like faculty housing improve, but
right.
What's the payoff there for the students as their tuition goes up and up and up and up and up? And of course, the cost of college is also inflated by this signal that, you know, the government provides money for it. There's easy money for it. Why wouldn't you raise your prices
tuition,
and you know, continue all of these extravagant but unnecessary expansion projects that we've seen in the last couple decades? Yeah. So, I mean, how higher education increase in costs has almost paralleled other, you know, subsidized industries like healthcare. So, this is going to burst. As far as the culture side of that, I don't know. I think that a lot of this stuff will just kind of exhaust itself over the next few years, or something bigger will happen in the news. There'll be some crisis that supersedes this. A lot of people don't remember this, but a lot of the social justice narratives that are so popular today were also quite visible. And these people were quite vocal in the 1990s. There was a lot of identity politics going on in popular culture. You know, MTV was all over this all the time. Everybody remembers like the racial dynamic of, you know, the LA riots or the O.J. Simpson trial. But 9/11 and the war on terror silenced all of that. So, you know, another grand event, if history has taught us anything, another grand event like that, even if it's not terrorism, is coming. And there just might not be room for all of this attention, you know, on these issues in the near future, or it just burns itself out for some other reason, or it's just ridiculed to death. I'm not sure, but that it can't continue on the trajectory that it's followed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. And I mean, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was a little young, you know, even back then, to be paying attention to the news cycle much. And I grew up in kind of a cabin in the middle of the woods too, homeschooled, and we didn't have access to a lot of media back then. But yeah, and it also makes me really grateful that, you know, nowadays the dialogue on higher education and does the college degree still have the same value it did 5-10 years ago? That dialogue is growing, you know, on a daily basis. I think the national debate on that, and I think it's growing with the voices that really matter to graduates too, which is, you know, employers and innovators and industry leaders, you know, like Peter Thiel and Tim Page and Jeff Bezos and Richard Branson and Elon Musk. And but I wonder, Brett, another question I had for you is, the other day I posted some thoughts on my Facebook feed on diversity in college, and it sparked this big debate on my page there. And you know, my thoughts were this: is that, you know, in especially in like K through 12, but I think also in higher education, many students are kind of compelled to be, you know, confined in these environments where the majority of the people they're around are roughly, you know, not all there's definitely anomalies and outliers, but roughly, you know, people definitely the same age, same level of experience, you know, many of the same background and stuff, versus, you know, the environments you'd be exposed to in the real world. And I said, you know, the only other environment that you'll be in that's kind of like that is possibly a nursing home. And it sparked this big debate because, you know, a lot of people were talking about they've been to several universities, and I've visited. I've only attended one community college for a while, and then I've visited a lot of universities though. And so people were talking about, you know, on one hand, an institution like a university forces you to kind of assimilate into and be with people from different backgrounds and stuff that you wouldn't normally experience, because when you do get out in the real world, you tend to just stick with groups that kind of have your same ideology, same background, and stuff like that. And then I was kind of arguing back, well, at that point, it becomes your responsibility to expose yourself to different kinds of people and more diversity and stuff. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on that, because, you know, speaking of like social justice warriors and stuff like that, they're always preaching, you know, more diversity, yet, you know, I see them kind of in this institution where it's really a closed system and very unlike the real world. And so, yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I mean, to them, I'd be interested in hearing like what kind of feedback you got, or what sense you got from the people who were, you know, maybe hostile or upset with your comments. What are the benefits of diversity? Like, that's the question that you're not allowed to ask. But like, I'm not saying there aren't benefits to them, to diversity, but what are people, if you think about how much energy and excitement and enthusiasm and vitriol goes into the idea of diversity, there must be very clear reasons about, you know, why it's good. So what do we get back if we ask that? Or what have you gotten back if you ask that? Or how would you even try to answer that? Why
diversity is good?
Yeah.
I mean, for me, I've been involved and exposed to, because I am a very, you know, curious person, very experimental. I can truthfully look back on my life and say everything that I've ever wanted to do so far, I have done or experimented with, and most of the time I mean, you know, there's a lot of challenges and mistakes I've made involved with that, but I mean, diversity in terms of both diverse environments and diverse relationships with people, you know, all different kinds of people, has been valuable to me to provide a lot of perspective. And so, yeah, I guess I would say the biggest value of diversity for me would be perspective. And I suppose the next question is, why is perspective valuable? And again, speaking for myself, it's just helped me. It's helped me evaluate opportunities better. I think it's helped me be a little more well-rounded in my general approach to life. And I mean, I'm also just thinking of like the whole fact that I had a debate on my Facebook page is because I try to foster relationships and friendships with people that with different, you know, political views and religious views, which in turn gives me more perspective as opposed to somebody who just completely, you know, shuts themselves off to that and tends to hang around with only people who think the same. But I don't know. What would you say?
Well, I would say I agree with you. Based on the answer that you've given, there's huge payoffs for what you're describing, which is intellectual diversity, right? Viewpoint diversity. Now, if you went to a college rally, Kylon, and you said, if you tried to change the chant from what do we want diversity, when do we want it now, to what do we want intellectual diversity, and when do we want it now, what do you think the reaction of the college left would be? I think you know, it's a rhetorical question. We know what it is when intellectual diversity shows up. You know, pepper spray and fire alarms and fires set and windows broken and people crying.
Bike locks to the face.
Exactly. So to them, diversity means something else. It's a diversity that is very aesthetic, right? It is about racial diversity and ethnic diversity, and about you know, elevating different types of people into leadership positions and into faculty positions. And we could say that, you know, this is breaking down a meritocracy because it's not necessarily giving the jobs to the most qualified people. But there is, you know, there is a way to see this call for diversity in, I think, a more empathetic light for the people who are calling for it. You know, there are, you know, a lot of minorities who are brought into college through, you know, prior calls for diversity. And while they're there, like all of us, you know, they need mentorship, and they want to feel at home, and they want to feel comfortable for what for a lot of them is a pretty alien environment. So the faculty play more of a role in their life than just somebody who stands in the front of the room and gives a lecture. Faculty are advisors. Faculty, take on the role of mentors and guides in matters academic, but also beyond academic. So I think that a lot of people who come from minority backgrounds, they want to feel comfortable and they want to feel like they have, people who understand them that they can talk to, people who understand their experiences. And maybe they don't feel that way with somebody who isn't from the same racial or ethnic background. And I think it's understandable if that is a very important part of their identity. But I think a lot of the education, or I shouldn't call it that, the messaging in a lot of the programs that are popular right now in higher education is basically telling, people of all different backgrounds that your identity, supersedes your individuality. Who you are on the outside is what matters most. And we need to make this place look and feel, the way we want to, based on how people are on the outside, not on the inside. I mean, diversity almost has a prejudice built into it, right? If you say we need more Asians, imagine saying, going anywhere and saying this place needs more whites. That sounds terrible. That sounds like and it is terrible. It is a terrible thing to say, but there's some kind of presumption, right? Where if you say this place needs more of this minority group, there's a presumption about what that minority group is going to offer, or what, an individual from that minority background is going to offer based on some kind of a stereotype. So it's not really about tolerance or freeing the individual in the way that they talk about, freeing the individual from oppression or injustice. It's pigeonholing and stereotyping just in, a PC leftist kind of friendly way. So that's very problematic for me as well. And we see, tons of that happening. I'm friends with a professor up at Dartmouth, and, she's been sharing a lot of her frustrations with me. She talked about they wanted to bring in a new dean of students who had a Native American background, and there were debates over the qualifications of this person, and they wound up not approving them. So they had a faculty meeting, and students at an Ivy League school, adults, showed up and started shouting racist at all of the faculty members in attendance. And these are people who are decidedly not racist, even though apparently the definition of that word has expanded dramatically over the last couple of years. But that's a really frustrating thing to watch, especially for a lot of these professors who are really, really committed in across a variety of different areas of study. They're really, really committed to seeing that these kids get an education. They're passionate about that, and they're really frustrated about a lot of the higher education culture right now as well. So we're kind of still stuck in this diversity question, though, and I'm trying to remember how we got to that, because I want to make sure we close that loop.
Well, I was just asking what you thought about it, and I learned something new already, and I think you have closed it, which is you kind of split it up into there's kind of aesthetic diversity and intellectual diversity, and it sounds like people need to focus more on intellectual diversity, which is definitely more what I was talking about than just diversity based on skin color in many cases.
Right. And I think that kind of, it's symbolic of a bigger problem, that people want easy answers, right? If once you start to care about something, you want the quick solution, especially when you're young, I think, especially when you lack perspective and you're shielded from perspective in the world of higher education. If something looks like a solution, we'll take it. If there's an easy explanation, I mean, that's certainly how I was when I was a teenager. Give me the easiest path, the easiest answer, the easiest explanation, right?
Yeah.
And it might not just be because I'm lazy. It might be that I, lack the life experience or the wisdom to see the myriad possibilities there. So having aesthetic diversity looks like a solution. even though since the 1960s, it's only produced more problems in higher education. Not diversity itself, but the use of diversity as like a solution for prior racial and ethnic tensions. We'll just bring more people in, and then they'll have this opportunity and everything will be fine. But a lot of these minority students, they feel like they're tokens, in these institutions, and they feel like they're, I think the word I used before was coddled or placated. And when people have self-respect, those kinds of treatments, that registers. And I think it registers, even if it's not conscious, over time, like treated that way, it doesn't feel good. It doesn't make you feel comfortable to be treated like, you're somebody that they dragged in behind Hillary Clinton for a speech to make her followers look more diverse or whatever. Right. You don't feel like a person, you feel like an object. So I think a lot of the frustrations that minority students feel in higher education are really, really justified because, the sort of social planners that have tried to make college look more like the United Colors of Benetton ad, they were really ham-fisted about how they did it. And they didn't take, the individual into account. Everything is a scientific management project. Everything is a social engineering project. And, individuals always, whether it's politics or, social solutions or economics, the individual always falls by the wayside in those kinds of plans. And that is certainly the case in higher education. And it has created a very, very messy social environment that really isn't serving anywhere. I was kind of tongue-in-cheek before when I said white males are making out because they're actually having to go through the gauntlet, but they're not being served by the system, either anymore in a lot of cases. They're not being helped by that culture, because what are you learning if you're in a school where the social justice war is a hot war, right? And like if you're a white male or a conservative at Berkeley, what are the attitudes that you're even going to form to your political opponents or minority groups, because they're the ones who wind up being the lightning rod for this, unfortunately. We've seen this massive upsurge in misogyny, sexism, racism, xenophobia just in the last 3 years. And I really think that the college left that has become very public through Twitter and YouTube and various other platforms and occurrences, they are very responsible for driving that upsurge in those really unfortunate mindsets that we thought as a society, we'd like to think as a society, we're over at this point, but they're making a comeback. And I think that it is a kind of equal and opposite reaction to a lot of the behavior that we see most often in higher education.
And now I wonder what advice you'd have for people listening who are maybe in a college and they're experiencing those type of situations. What advice you'd have for them to, reclaim that individuality and that intellectual diversity. I mean, would you say it could be as simple as just spending more time away from campus, or?
Yeah, I think that it's a really tricky thing. You feel much more immersed in these kinds of situations when you live on campus. And unfortunately, there are some schools, a lot of these schools are so big, like UConn, the University of Connecticut's an entire town. There's no escaping the college culture there. Hanover, New Hampshire is like that to a certain extent too, where Dartmouth is. So I'm getting away. If you're in your second or third year or whenever people move off campus, I think it helped me when I was in college, even though I wasn't dealing with this set of problems at all. It helped me for other reasons. It helped me be more independent, to not be able to shuffle into a cafeteria with a pair of inside-out sweatpants on and slippers and have somebody make me an omelet. That's just, I understand that's one of the perks of living on campus, but 4 years of doing that doesn't prepare you for independent living. So, getting bills in the mail when I'm, 19 years old, dealing with a plumber, with the oil company, with learning how to, mediate conflicts with neighbors. when you can't run to anybody, you can't run to campus security or to the RA, like that kind of adult living, and it also gives you perspective that you can see how big the world actually is. That you're shielded from that in campus living. In a lot, I'm sure some places are worse than others, but that was a really helpful experience for me. I moved off campus as soon as I could. I think I did it when I was 19, when I was a sophomore, and it was very confronting. In a lot of ways. It wasn't the nicest town where the school was, and I didn't exactly love the people that I lived around. But it was good. But it also motivated me.
Yeah.
I don't want to live here any longer than I have to. So I think that would be one thing. This is the college students that I've talked to. These other clubs have developed. Like college Republicans are growing faster than I probably maybe than they ever have right now. So I've talked to people who are parts of the College Republicans Club, and they find that they get support from a like-minded peer group. But I think there's also a danger in that, that's a separate kind of isolation. But it's almost like a lot of them don't have a choice. They cannot talk to people with whom they disagree. That's kind of like off limits now, and it seems to get worse month after month after month. The dialogue window just gets smaller and smaller and smaller.
Oh man, yeah.
So, I mean, it's gonna come to a head, and I don't know what that's gonna look like. I don't know if it's gonna be ridiculed out of existence. I don't know if it's just gonna, burn itself out. I think we're gonna see more events like what we saw at Berkeley a couple months ago. It's gonna this thing that just happened at Evergreen College with Brett Weinstein, I think was his name, where he's basically surrounded by students. It was a really, really ugly and scary scene.
That was insane.
Yeah. And I mean, so that's, the path that we're on, and where that goes, I do not know. But, the best advice I could give is like really, do an honest self-assessment and ask yourself, do I need to be here? Is this the only path to get me to where I want to go? And maybe it is, and that's unfortunate. And, then you have to think about some of the solutions we've already talked about. But there are a lot of people who are in college who don't need to be there, and they don't even know why they're there. I mean, that's the amazing thing.
Yep, totally. That's one of my biggest pet peeves, to go into college to figure out what you want to do. A lot of time spending mom and dad's money too, which is it's doing a disservice to them too. But I'll set up that just gave me a great idea for a business, right? Like you can get all the average tuition prices from every state, and I'll say, I'll help you decide what you want to do for $15,000. Now, that would be great, but that's not what people aren't really just going to decide what to do, even though they go in not knowing what to do, thinking that college will help them decide. They're trying to get that credential, right? They're trying to get that job lottery ticket. That's why they're really there. And that was, back to the praxis, the tangible thing that really I think has the potential to bring about progress, is that you can offer employers, in a lot of corporations and even smaller companies are really, really bureaucratized. I worked for a recruiting service for a while. We did technical recruiting, and I would stumble across. That's a really difficult industry, because the matches have to be really, really super specific, and you have to find somebody with a really unique blend of skills to do certain types of engineering jobs, in certain applications or locations. And I would come across a magical resume of somebody who'd been like a mechanical engineer since 1970. So he had all this experience with these old, outdated technologies that needed to be updated. But he also knew how, for some reason, he knew how to use this new microstation, 3D modeling software, and like, what a find. And then you take it, and it's a government job, it's a power plant or something, and they won't even look at him because he doesn't have a 4-year degree. Right. So there's catch up for a lot of corporations and government to play here as well. It's not just the public mind or the university mind that needs to change. Yeah, well, totally. And you've got now companies like Ernst & Young and then Google and starting to change their mindset on that. So I think it's coming. I think it's on its way.
I have one of my best friends runs a national collections agency, and when he has any say in hiring, he doesn't even want to look at people who have college degrees.
Really?
You know? He's just like, all right, well, they haven't been equipped to do what we need them to do. They're probably not trainable because they think they're smarter than everybody. And, they're lazy. They've got bad habits. And they might bring a bunch of baggage in, too, with entitlement and expectations. And this is the next place, my parents took care of me, then the college took care of me, and now my employer takes care of me. Right. So that's like, 21 years of momentum of being taken care of. When on the other hand, you could go find somebody who either got a GED or a high school diploma and then got right out into the work world. This is a person who kind of knows the score as far as like the employer-employee relationship. They know the expectations. They know there's benefits that come along with their salary, but the employer's responsibility in making them happy is very, very limited. While somebody else languished in college, they've had, 4 years of experience learning those lessons. As if I were hiring people, I'd be looking for the latter,
Yep.
Somebody who's a little bit seasoned and somebody who's a little bit more in touch with reality.
Yeah. No, totally. I mean, on the show recently, I've tried to introduce these two words, direct credentialing and indirect credentialing, to illustrate that point where indirect credentialing I tend to define as more of a credential from a third-party institution that basically says you've studied a lot of things, you've studied a lot of theory, now you're ready for real-world experience, whereas direct credentialing is more you've had, here's the real-world experience I have and the tangible evidence for that, here's the value I've provided, here's my digital footprint, and then you're approaching employers with that. And I think there's still a place, for the indirect credential. You've got a doctor, for instance, where there is definitely some classroom time involved. Even praxis has their boot camp is kind of like classroom time. But every doctor knows that their residency is coming up, and they've got to start developing those direct credentials. And so I try to encourage people who listen to start acquiring those direct credentials as soon as possible, because that is ultimately what will help you progress through life and achieve your goals, even if they're to just start your own business someday. And if that looks like a lot of different things to a lot of different people, but it could be something as complicated or ambitious as starting your own business, or and that could be a smaller business. And Derek McGill, his second episode's coming out soon. We talked about a lot of different small businesses you can start, or it could be something as simple as starting a blog, where you blog and share your thoughts on a regular basis.
Well, and it also, once you build up that kind of skill set, like what I would say to teenagers now that would get me fired from any college consulting job in the country is, pick something you're passionate about and start building a portfolio. And that's the advice that I, give my nephew who's almost failed out of school. And I'm encouraging my brother to pull him out of school, let him get a GED and let him go somewhere and actually experience success. Based on what he wants to do. Like, this place failed, right? So he's just going to be stuck here for another year and a half, failing and feeling bad about it. Get him out. Get him in a GED class, as long as he wants to do that. Get him in a GED class and get him doing something that actually kind of gives him meaning and gets him thinking about, some kind of purpose in life. I wanted to ask you, too, for the benefit of my audience, you also use this phrase on your website, auto-credentialing. How does that relate to direct versus indirect?
Direct versus indirect credentialing came as a result of the word auto-credentialing. I was talking to my dad. We were actually skiing together one day, and I was talking to him about auto-credentialing or self-credentialing. I couldn't decide what to call it, but I wanted to come up with a word because I was always talking about the concept of basically building your own signal, building your own credential outside of say, formal schooling. And so I was trying to come up with just a word so I could just say it and people would know what I mean. And but then we were starting to talk about there are different kinds of credentials, and I think it can easily be boiled down to indirect credentialing versus direct credentialing. And so that just came out of a discussion. So I'm trying to actually get rid of. I stopped saying auto credentialing in favor of direct credentialing versus indirect credentialing, because I think it's a little bit more clear and is a little bit more specific to what's actually going on out there.
Yeah, it also relates to something else that I've heard you talk about a few times, that a dichotomy that I really like, which is just-in-case learning versus just-in-time learning.
Oh, yeah.
And I'm going to start using this, Kylan's dichotomy here, because I think this is a really valuable way to think about, schooling versus education. And what we were talking about with credentialing is really about how you can show your skill or your usefulness to other people. It is, as you said, a signal. But this just in case versus just in time is more about like what it actually means or doesn't mean to you as an individual, if that makes sense. The distinction that you make is just in case learning is basically the schooling that we get, right? You get a high school diploma just in case you need, all of this crap somewhere in your life. And just in case learning is also in many cases a college degree, where lots of people, will get a degree in a specific discipline. They'll go into that field and feel like the degree didn't even really prepare them for what they ultimately wind up doing in that field. Yeah. And this idea of just-in-time learning, which I do as a podcaster, I do so much of that. I learn something when I need to know it because I'm intrinsically motivated to learn it, so more of it sticks. Right.
Absolutely.
So if you could just take these kids at the time in their life where they're most, malleable in their brains and they're most curious, and just do the just in time learning. And some parents do a good job of it, and sometimes they even do. It's school teachers. Like if Billy has a random thought in the middle of fourth grade while the teacher's reading The Hobbit, he can put his hand up and ask that question, and maybe the teacher will have a thoughtful answer about it. But it's certainly not the norm in school,
right?
Because it's an individual pursuit. I'm motivated right now. I'm intrinsically motivated and curious about this specific thing. So I'd like to stop the proceedings here. And I'm sorry if this inconveniences the other 40 people in the room. And I'd like to pursue that for myself. That's not happening, So I think that's really, really valuable. And it also, it exposes how much time is being wasted. We're in public school for 15,000 hours. Right?
That's insane.
And the best education critics, or my favorite education critic, who taught for 30 years, this guy John Taylor Gatto, he said, any kid of reasonable ability can learn to write in less than the number I think he always threw out was 80 hours of instruction.
Yep.
Can learn and read to write well.
Yep.
And can probably do a lot of that work building up those skills without direct instruction. But that's over 14,900 hours unaccounted for there,
Yeah. Well, then he also breaks down, remember, he breaks down, I'm reading second time through reading Dumbing Us Down, and he breaks down kind of the average schedule of somebody who's in a formal schooling environment throughout the week. And I think he comes up with, it's somewhere between 6 and 9 hours of just personal time where you're able to kind of have some introspection, do things and pursue things that you're actually curious about, which is just insane.
Yeah. And in the beginning, that was no accident, not to completely change the subject here, but the people who set up the schools wanted a kind of machine-like behavior because that's what society demanded. School, that's what industry demanded. School was a branch of industry and a tool of governance. That was the language of the people who were responsible for creating these scientific management schools. And, their fears were justified. There was this huge immigrant population pouring into the country. This is just decades after hundreds of thousands of slaves were set free, and people in the ivory towers weren't too comfortable with either of those things, So, and then if you read a book like by Thaddeus Russell, the book Renegade History of the United States, and you hear these stories about we hired a bunch of Irish immigrants to build this bridge, and they got drunk and threw bottles at each other all day. It's there's a problem there to be solved. I understand that, but it might have been a little overkill with the scientific management Prussian schools that were set up. But that problem in a completely I mean, there still is obviously an industrial economy in the United States, but there's also this massively expanding creative economy that people get no preparation for in school. I mean, fortunately, the little free time that kids do have, they're so inundated with all of these, creative experiences and, potential to discover new interests or to be inspired by somebody on YouTube that didn't exist, 15 years ago. And more and more of those kids can actually have an outlet. Their voice can go somewhere today. Mm-hmm. And, that's a new and exciting thing. So maybe, even though school really crushes that in people, the creative types are still able to once in a while find the direction they need.
Yeah, and coming full circle again, I mean, that's where learning by doing and just-in-time learning is so powerful. Because if you're listening to this and you're inspired right now to take action, to do something, maybe something on YouTube inspired you, and you're like, I want to start a vlog, I want to start something in this vertical or on this subject or for this industry. The best thing I could suggest to you is to you probably know what the first step is right now. Whatever that first step is, you're probably thinking about it. Take that first step. I think the problem is so many people think, well, I have to have these sort of credentials. I have to, go to school for X amount of time, get the approval of these, quote unquote experts in the field before I'm able to do this. And boy, that's just not the case. And especially with technology and the internet and how connected the world is, that's not the case. I like to give the example of putting together IKEA furniture, which is my idea of hell is just perpetually putting together IKEA furniture. But nobody in their right mind takes the IKEA, you buy a desk and you take the manual to bed with you the night before you put it together to kind of study it and prepare for putting the desk together. Nobody does that. You open up the box, and whatever it is, you can usually kind of intuitively, if you've played with Legos or anything, you can kind of figure out what the first couple steps are. Actually, Legos is a much better example of this. I used to play with Legos all the time, and I would only look at the manual if you get a new Lego set and you say you're putting together like a spaceship. I'd only look at that manual when I absolutely had to. Otherwise, I was trying to figure it out on my own. I could usually figure out the first couple parts, and then I have no idea where this piece goes. Okay, you look at the manual. All right, that piece, goes here. Now I understand how this fits together, and so that's the analogy I like to give there.
I think too that there's this there's this schooled attitude that a lot of people approach those new endeavors with, where it's like it's either success or failure, and one is unacceptable, right? Like, yes. I don't know how to do it, I won't succeed. I started doing School Sucks podcast badly. All I thought I had to do was get my voice onto an MP3 file and figure out how to get it on the internet. I didn't know anything about sound quality. So I just started doing this incredibly shitty sounding podcast. But because, I wasn't letting my technical inexperience or my technical ignorance get in the way of something that I was passionate about, it wound up on the internet and it got a following. And eventually people said, hey, shithead, get a different microphone. And then I said, oh, okay, I did. And then it got better and better and better from there, because it was driven by something that I was passionate and intrinsically motivated to do. So, I mean, there's lots of people. There's this book, I forget what it's called, the 20-hour, something about how you learn anything in 20 hours. You learn enough to want to continue doing it in 20 hours of work.
Gotcha.
I'll send you the link. You can put it in the show notes if you want. But I did a show about it a couple of years ago. And, start messing around with something. Don't say this is the project that defines me, and say brettveinotte.com and start writing terrible blog articles. That's not the way you want to do it. I tell people, like, if I give people advice about starting a podcast, I say do 5 throwaways, and then if you succeed, you can make them you can make them gifts for people who support the show, or that you can make them email opt-in enticements or whatever sometime in the future. You want to hear us when we really sucked. But I didn't do that. The first moment I ever talked into the microphone about this stuff, that's on the internet now, Yep. So that's too bad, I guess. I mean, I even thought, like, 2011, 2012, 2013, through all those years, I thought about, like, looking back at the stuff that I did in 2009. I was like, God, that sucks so bad. I should just go re-record it all. because people are never going to listen to that now. Because like it is now outdated. Like that audio is not good enough anymore to be taken seriously when it is so easy to make a decent sounding podcast today.
Right.
I mean, you can almost fall into doing that because the technology has come so far in 7 or 8 years. Yeah. I'm sure your listeners already know a lot of this, but as that confidence builds, so does a momentum for going forward. Just through that trial and error process, I think that was really, really helpful for me in the 3 skill sets that are most essential in the show: the podcasting, the artwork, and the video production. And now I need to take that lesson for myself and apply it to things like email marketing and designing a course, right? Which I've started to do, but reflecting on those past successes now applied to new areas that are going to help me grow.
Yeah, and like when I was just talking with Derek McGill not too long ago, we were talking about transferable skills, and as you try new things, a lot of times everything won't be in the same vein. Like you'll try, I've been involved in many different businesses and different industries, but throughout all of those, there are these transferable skills where even though there's been some success and a lot more failure than that, these skills just kind of transfer, and there's this compounding interest that you start to notice. And I mean, we were talking about failure and fear of failure and making mistakes a little while ago, and I just think that's something that the formal schooling system has really instilled in a lot of people, is this fear of failure, because it's you either pass or you fail, or you get these, if you get a wrong answer, you get a little red check mark, and you're always taught that it's something to avoid. If possible, you want to get 100% on every single test, every single piece of work you're supposed to spend time on. But we forget, even just being born, learning how to walk, you fall a bunch. It's how you learn. Or this attitude when you're young and you're riding your bike and you fall over and scrape your knee, and your parents are like, yay, it's like we still need to have that kind of mentality about failure. And that's something I wish I would have, looking back now, talking to like my 18-year-old self, I wish I would have told myself to like quit worrying so much about failure and making mistakes and things just not being where you think they should be right now. Just keep doing what you're interested in and what you love to do. And God, I would even decide not to do certain things because I was just like, I'll probably fail too much trying to accomplish that. So let's go this other route where I know I'm, have a better chance of success. And I wish I could have advised myself, now back then to the contrary of that, because failure, now I've learned to celebrate my failures and almost look forward to making mistakes in a way, because, it's like, Edison said, well, I've learned, 1,000 ways to not make a light bulb, that sort of concept. So.
Right. And there's some agency in that, right? There's some independence and also ultimately some accountability in that kind of thinking, right? Like the other way, like being afraid to fail, that's a very dependent mindset, because like, what are you afraid of? Mm-hmm. So it kind of removes that independence or accountability from the equation. You mentioned being involved in like all these businesses. I know you did this show where you talked about having a painting company, which by the way, I used to love to paint. Like sometimes I just want to not do that exclusively. Oh my God, when I was a teacher, this is the best job in the world. Most of the things that I know today, I learned on a ladder, because it was when, I got my first iPod. And I just loaded up with like podcasts and audio presentations and audio books, and I'd go work 8 or 10 hours. It's great work. People usually leave you alone. I'd work for somebody. I'd build up a trusting relationship. I'd be alone on a job, and Kylan, I would pause my iPod. Like I'd listen to stuff I disagreed with. I'd listen to like the Real Time with Bill Maher podcast or something, and I'd pause it, and I'd just be on the ladder painting, having a debate with myself. Yeah, just telling those people that I was just listening to why they were wrong. And actually, that was like a nice preparation for what I actually do now. And it's probably why I was able to like blurt out 20 or 30 episodes right from the get-go 8 years ago, because I'd been talking to myself on a ladder for so long.
Oh my gosh, dude, we're like brothers, man. That's exactly the same here. I feel like it says a lot about somebody, at least to me, now knowing what painting is like when they enjoy painting. Most people don't. It's very monotonous. For some people, But man, I remember that like I racked up so many hours on Audible, and just like you're saying, I'd be painting some baseboard or something for hours just listening to these books, and I would always stop and write down my thoughts on a little, my notes app, and keep going. Definitely had many debates with myself. That's incredible to hear that.
Yeah, fresh air, heights. If you're into that, there's some great opportunities to be high up and scare yourself. But yeah, I just love the independence, the learning opportunity. It was therapeutic work in a way. But not for you when you had this company at times. And I remember you telling this story. I think the title of the episode was "Success is Not a Choice," right? Where the only way forward. Just for my audience, the background was you got into trouble by hiring the wrong subcontractor who basically took off without doing the requisite amount of work or any work at all. And then there were all these unpaid people who were looking at you because they were subcontracting for your company. And you had to there wasn't going to be a conclusion until you solved all those problems. Right. And I think that a lot of people, and I also know that you barely went to school, right? You were home educated, and then you did a year of high school. So not having that schooled mindset, you could meet a task like that with a kind of independence and accountability that a lot of others they wouldn't have been prepared for that situation. So I thought that was a very cool story.
Yeah, it is definitely an exercise in taking personal responsibility. Because the whole main message of the episode, that the message I was trying to draw out from what I would consider to be my worst entrepreneurial moment, in that kind of 3 to 6 months period, was the fact that at that point we had so many different people relying on us for. And I talk about this concept called extreme ownership, and it's based on a book called Extreme Ownership by 2 ex-Navy SEALs, and I was in BUDS in class 296 for a while, and so the Navy SEAL culture, and this just in general the special operative culture and stuff, is very near and dear to me in a lot of ways. And they talk about this concept of extreme ownership, where you take responsibility for not just the things that are obviously your responsibility, like I personally made this mistake, but also the things that would look to the average person like you had nothing to do with that, or maybe you have there's a good excuse for it. And so the sub we hired, he'd hired a bunch of people that really didn't know what they were doing. They did bad work, and then he had taken off and hadn't paid these people. And, I show up and they're demanding to be paid. And, at first glance, and honestly, my first thought for like a day was like, I'm not going to pay these people because it's not my responsibility. And then eventually coming around to the realization that it's like I hired the guy who hired them and didn't pay them. And then going beyond that to just think of all the residents in all these buildings that we had said we'd paint. They didn't even know me. They didn't even frankly care that their place was getting painted, like a lot of them, or even pay attention to it. But it's like, we have a signed contract with my name on it that says we're going to give these people a new paint job. We were building another business at the same time. And so just extending that principle out to think of, if we would have kind of just put our heads in the sand and given up, in a lot of ways, we wouldn't have built the other 2 businesses we were building at the same time while all this was going on, and we were looking at bankruptcy. And now, because we kind of pressed forward and went through all that crap, which I look back on now with more fondness than anything, we've just been able to help so many people. And so really the whole episode was just a calling for people to consider success as a duty and not an option, and to put it in the same space in your mind as you do to put a roof over your head and pay your bills. It's that kind of responsibility, because you have no idea the kind of potential you have and the kind of impact you make. And if you decide to just not pursue something because you're afraid of failure, or there's a fear there, you could potentially be doing a disservice to hundreds, thousands, and in like Brett's case, like millions of people, if you wouldn't have decided to launch the School Sucks project. So
yeah, well, I appreciate that, you saying that. I appreciate you exaggerating the number accidentally. But no, I think both to speak to your story there, and the impact. I still have this impulse when something goes wrong and it's embarrassing, and I know it's my fault, to fall into that sort of school/employment collectivistic mindset where it's like, okay, how can I escape into the crowd here or disappear into the crowd?
Yeah.
Right. Which is fairly easy to do in school or various types of employment, because it's in a lot of situations it's hard to tell who exactly is to blame. And there's always that moment in school where the kid throws the spitball at the chalkboard and the teacher turns around and said, "Who did it?" Okay, everyone's punished, right? So like when and basically it's interesting because the lesson there is, in a world without accountability, it sucks for everybody, right?
Yes.
So that's a really valuable story, and I liked how I connected with it through my love of painting. So
yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah.
Oh man. Well, we could probably start wrapping it up, man. I before we would, I have two more questions that I'd love to ask, if that's okay.
Sure. Yeah. Please.
I know you've heard this before because I ask all my guests these, but just, any parting advice that you'd have for our listeners who are still in school, but, after listening to an episode like this, they're thinking they may want to look at maybe some other options, like we were talking about earlier, and maybe, focus more on forging their own path. And so any parting advice for people like that?
Yeah, for the people who are struggling, one of the most important things that I've tried to convey through my show, because it continues to affect us beyond school, it continues to affect us as adults. You are not defective. And school will often make a lot of people who think outside of the mainstream or operate outside of, very specific top-down direction or instruction. It will make them feel defective. Yeah. I've seen that happen to a lot of people, and that creates a kind of fear and a kind of self-doubt that can continue well into adulthood. And I think we've even given some examples of that in the show today. And I also feel like there's a lot of people who are stuck in school for a variety of reasons. And, what I encourage them to do is just educate themselves about the history of public school and the politics of public school and the psychology of public school, which is a resource. Those are all resources we've tried to provide at schoolsucksproject.com. There's another site called schoolsurvival.net, and they deal with a lot of these topics and tell a lot of these stories. But, we've tried to cover this from all the angles and give those young people. I originally intended the show for the frustrated high school student that, I thought it would be great. Like, what would I have wanted someone to say to me when I was 16 years old and getting D's and feeling like I wasn't smart and I was always going to be a failure? And if you can put all of that in context, and you can see that the system is, just so broken. And a lot of the people who are working as operators in the system, teachers, administrators, guidance counselors, are dealing with their own challenges. And, you can, persevere through that. And the more you learn about what's going on around you, I think the easier it is to put a lot of those frustrations into perspective from a very young age. So I encourage people to, it's tough. I think it's more advice for parents who, for whatever reason, what happens most often is parents get divorced and, mom develops a very pro home education attitude and dad doesn't, or vice versa. So kids wind up in public school. Like, those parents, need to be really active in trying to explain that psychology of that kind of captivity to their children in a way that they will be able to, understand it and also survive it, and understand it's not about them. Nothing is wrong with me because I don't fit this mold. Maybe that means something is right with me, actually.
Oh, totally, man. That's some great advice. And how about any parting advice for people listening who are already on this journey?
The best from my experience, some of the best advice I could I could give is don't get obsessed with like the nobility of failure, right? Like everybody loves the Robert Kiyosaki story where he's like, "Oh man, I used to live in my car, and look at me now," right? So that's like it's almost like when you're starting something new, there's something attractive about accumulating all of these failure stories. I realized that my failure stories accumulate through the lack of proper planning, or the lack of seeing the big picture, hastily jumping into some kind of project without knowing why exactly I belong there. And I do get excited about new intellectual pursuits and go off on a road that I'm not exactly sure where it leads. And I think that's fine if I'm honest about that's what I'm doing. But there's little at stake when I do that. I think that a lot of the professional failures that I had, once I read something like Rich Dad Poor Dad, I said, "Oh, this will be a great story someday." But it is through, proper planning and subsequent proper execution, best to avoid those situations. And it is possible to do so in a lot of cases, right? So don't get wrapped up in the glamour of failure. Just because super successful people have cool failure stories.
Yeah, well, I really like the question you kind of implied there to ask yourself is what bad habit maybe is the source of the majority of my failures, So, no, I love that. I mean, for me, it's less about planning and probably more about overthinking, honestly. I'll tend to think things to death. And so I know that's the source of the majority of my failures or mistakes too, so... But anyways, Brett, what's the best way for people to connect with you?
Absolutely. People should go to schoolsucksproject.com. There is a drop-down menu in the main nav, and it's called Pod Classes. And you can see all the various domains that we've tackled through the years on topics like critical thinking, history and philosophy, self-sufficiency, psychology and wellness, communication, like all things that I think a lot of entrepreneurs need. But also, a lot of younger people who are just trying to survive school or higher education need as well. So, we try to be that resource for, people who are on that, self-directed learning journey.
Yes.
And we also have a YouTube channel. It's username School Sucks Podcast. And one of the things that I recommend, I made a series of videos based on John Taylor Gatto's book, The Underground History of American Education. Mm-hmm. I just took selections out of the book and turned them into these little, vignettes that kind of have this movie trailer pacing to them with music. And he was really actually quite pleased to see from what was reported to me. I haven't ever spoken to him directly, actually, but it was reported to me that he was pleased to see some of this stuff come to life and get new eyes in front of it. And actually went on to write a foreword for his new book, or a re-release of The Underground History, which was
no way.
Yeah, a very cool outcome to all of that work. So I recommend people go and check that video series out. I think it brings into focus a lot of the historical problems with public school and how it puts people on a very narrow path to go through life. There are reasons why. It's no accident, and of course, there's plenty of ways to get off, like we talk about on my podcast and on yours. But again, to help you with that contextual understanding of the school problem, I really recommend that. And then ultimately, I recommend people read that book.
Yes, I definitely would as well. Actually, I watched 3 of those, that video series, or maybe 2 of them, on your YouTube channel today. And I was just like, oh, John Taylor Gatto, yes, we got to watch that. And I love the visual representation. And I also haven't read that book by him yet. And so,
right. There are, my God, there's got to be thousands of those little excerpts in that book that just go all over the history of the whole school system.
Gosh, I love it. Yeah. So if you're listening, definitely go check that out. But successful dropouts, you are the average of the 5 people that you hang around the most. And you've been hanging out with Brett and Kylan today, learning what it takes to drop out, grind, and succeed. And so for everything we talked about today, head over to successfuldropout.com and type Brett into the search bar, and the show notes will pop right up. And as always, stay hungry, stay foolish. For more information about how to drop out, grind, and succeed, go to successfuldropout.com. I also love questions. If you have a question about anything we talked about today, I want to hear from you. Go to successfuldropout.com and click the Ask Me a Question link at the top of the page. Successful Dropouts, if you could go to iTunes and leave a positive rating and review, it would help this show out a lot. I know you're busy, I know you got a lot going on, but if you do that, it helps this podcast rank, it helps other people listen to it and gain value just like you have been. Thank you so much in advance.